Rain struck the tin roof like 1,000 tiny hammers, each drop echoing the slow heartbeat of a dying town. The lone rider reined in his horse before a shack leaning into the wind, its door hanging crooked, its light faint as a candle near its end. He was a tall man wrapped in a dark duster, boots mud-streaked from miles of silence. Beneath his hat, his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and kept too much. His name wasn't needed in that place, only his reputation rode ahead of him. The wealthy rancher who never sent men to do his work, the one who came himself when debts went unpaid. Inside, the stench of whiskey and regret filled the air. A man slumped at a table, unshaven, face wet with drink, clutching a bottle like it might hold back judgment. The rider stepped in, rain dripping from his coat, and said quietly, "You owe what you promised." His voice wasn't cruel, but it carried a stillness that demanded truth. The drunk's eyes darted toward a small drawer, then back to the stranger's revolver resting easy at his hip. He realized quickly this wasn't a man he could bluff. "I don't got it," the drunk slurred. "The crop failed, the mule died, the banker took the rest. You can take the shack if you want, it ain't worth dirt." The rider didn't blink. "Debt's not paid with pity," he said. The words hung there, cold and final. The drunk swallowed hard, then laughed in a way that wasn't laughter at all. He wiped his mouth and muttered, "You're a rich man. You don't need money." "Doesn't mean I forget what's owed," the rancher replied. His tone carried no anger, only weariness. The man's gaze wandered toward the doorway where a faint shape lingered, a girl no older than 20, barefoot, her hair tangled, eyes reflecting both fear and shame. She had the kind of beauty that made you ache to look too long, not because it was perfect but because it carried pain. The drunk's lips twisted, and in a single breath that soured the air, he said, "Then take her. She's a virgin. That ought to clear the debt." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. The rancher's jaw tightened. He turned, meeting the girl's eyes. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. "You'd sell your own blood?" he asked. The father's grin faltered, then broke into a sob. "You think I ain't sold worse?" The rancher set his hat on the table, the gesture deliberate, his patience running thin. "I came for what's owed, not for flesh." But when he looked back at the girl, she stepped closer, trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "If I stay, he'll sell me to someone else." "You're the first man who looked at him without fear." The rancher studied her for a long moment. She wasn't pleading for rescue, she was pleading for a chance to live. He saw bruises fading along her arms, the quiet defiance behind her trembling lips. Slowly, he reached into his coat, pulled out a pouch of silver, and tossed it on the table. "Your debt's settled," he said to the father. "But this girl walks out by choice, not price." The father collapsed forward, face in his hands, sobbing words too broken to understand. The rancher turned to leave. But the girl was already at the door, clutching a small sack, her entire life in cloth and silence. He glanced back once, seeing her there, half shadow, half hope. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked. She nodded. "I know what I'm leaving behind." He hesitated, as though the choice carried a weight neither of them would escape. Then he stepped out into the rain and she followed. The wind cut through their clothes, the road stretching before them like a scar across the land. The horse snorted, impatient. He helped her mount behind him, her hands gripping his coat as thunder rolled over the plains. They rode without speaking, the sound of hooves and rain filling the silence. He could feel her shivering against his back, but she didn't ask where they were going and he didn't offer comfort. Still, when lightning flashed, he tilted his hat slightly toward her, shielding her face from the sting of the storm. Small mercy, unseen but felt. After miles of mud and wind, they reached a rise where the land opened wide, endless prairie silvered by rain, the faint glow of his distant ranch burning low on the horizon. She looked out, whispering, "It's beautiful." He didn't answer. His mind was far from beauty, on the weight of what he'd just done. He'd come to collect a debt and left with something that would change everything. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew she'd never leave his thoughts. As they rode on, the storm began to break, and in the first weak light of dawn, the girl leaned her head against his back, exhaustion overtaking fear. He didn't move away. His hand tightened slightly on the reins, not to control the horse but to steady himself. For the first time in years he felt the ache of responsibility that wasn't born of gold or guilt, but of something far rarer, care. By the time they reached the edge of his land, the rain had slowed to mist. The girl slept, trusting a stranger more than her own kin. The rancher looked over the wide valley below, where his house waited like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He exhaled, low and heavy, and said to the morning air, "Debt's paid." but the cost's only begun. And with that, the horse carried them forward into the quiet dawn, two souls bound by a single uneasy choice, one that would not end with silver or mercy, but with redemption bought in blood. The ranch sprawled across the valley like a kingdom built of silence and dust. Fences stretched toward the horizon, and the main house rose pale against the dawn, its wooden beams gleaming faintly from last night's rain. When the rancher dismounted, the girl slid off the horse with trembling legs. She had never seen so much open land. Her bare feet sank into the damp earth, and she stood still for a long time, eyes wide, as if afraid the world might vanish if she breathed too loud. He watched her quietly. She was no longer the terrified girl from the shack. Something in her had steadied during the ride. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and leather. Everything was clean but cold, order without warmth. She moved carefully, touching nothing, though her eyes lingered on the shelves lined with ledgers and rifles. A kettle hissed softly on the stove. The rancher poured water into 2 cups and handed one to her. "You can stay here till you figure where you're headed," he said. His voice carried no invitation, only permission. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup for heat. The tea burned her tongue, but she didn't flinch. He studied her posture, the straight back, the quiet defiance, and wondered how long she'd been learning to survive by silence. For a time neither spoke. The wind sighed against the walls, and the floorboards creaked as if remembering footsteps that once filled the house. He saw her gaze drift to a photograph above the fireplace, 2 men standing beside a horse, one smiling, the other not. "My brother," he said simply. "Buried out back." She looked at him then, eyes softening. "You live here alone?" He gave a small nod. "Some debts don't end even when they're paid." The days that followed moved slow, shaped by habit. He worked the corral while she swept floors and washed dishes that already gleamed. At dusk, he'd sit on the porch, watching the sky bruise purple, while she lingered near the barn, feeding the horses bits of apple she'd saved. They rarely spoke, yet an understanding grew between them, quiet and unspoken. He noticed the way she studied everything, from the rhythm of his hands to the curve of the land. She noticed how he always left a lamp burning at night, as if waiting for someone who never came. One morning she found him repairing the fence near the southern field. His sleeve was rolled up, revealing the faint line of an old brand scarred into his skin. The mark was crude, a symbol half burned, half healed. She didn't ask about it, but he caught her glance and said, "I used to ride with men who believed loyalty was worth blood. I learned better." The words hung heavy. She wanted to ask more, but his tone made it clear that the past was buried deep, and digging would hurt them both. That evening, a storm gathered again, black clouds swallowing the hills. She lit the lamps and found him at the table with a bottle he hadn't touched in years. The thunder rattled the windows as she placed her hand over his. "You don't have to drink to remember," she said. He met her gaze, surprised by the firmness in her voice. "And you don't have to forget to live," he answered. For a heartbeat, they shared something raw, a mutual recognition of pain too old to name. Then she withdrew her hand and busied herself with the fire, cheeks flushed. Later that night, when the wind had settled into a steady moan, he walked out to check the horses. On the barn door, carved deep into the wood, he found a mark, a circle with a jagged line slashing through it. His body went still. He knew that sign. It was the calling card of men he once betrayed, the kind who didn't send warnings unless they meant to finish what they started. The past had found him again. He turned toward the house and saw the glow of lamplight through the window. She was inside, her silhouette bent over the table, mending a tear in her dress. The sight struck him harder than the threat itself. He had brought danger home to someone who deserved peace. He returned inside, saying nothing. She noticed his pallor but didn't question it. Instead, she offered a quiet smile. "The storm's passing," she said. He nodded, though he knew better. The real storm hadn't yet begun. He watched her move about the room, careful and graceful, unaware of the shadow creeping back into his world. For a brief, selfish moment, he wished she'd never spoken that word, yes, on the night they met. Yet as he watched her laugh softly at the fire's crackle, he realized he couldn't imagine the silence without her anymore. Before going to bed, he locked the doors, checked his rifle, and stood by the window a long while. Outside, the rain glimmered faintly under moonlight, and far in the distance, lightning flickered against the hills like a warning. He felt the old ache in his chest, the one that came before every reckoning. Behind him, her voice broke the quiet. "You'll tell me when it's time to leave, won't you?" He didn't turn around. "If I tell you, that means it's too late," he said. She rose from the chair, her shadow joining his at the window. Then I'm not leaving, she whispered. He looked down at her reflection in the glass, eyes steady, not afraid. Something in him, long dormant, stirred. She wasn't a burden or a debt anymore. She was the last honest thing left in his life. Outside, a wolf howled low and distant. He placed his hand against the window pane and murmured, "Let them come." In that moment, the silence between them became something sacred, fragile, and dangerous. The rain eased, the fire dimmed, and the night held its breath, as though the world itself knew that the peace they stood in would not last. Dawn arrived thin and cold, the kind of light that made everything look honest. The rancher was already awake, sharpening his knife by the window. Outside, mist rolled low across the fields, blurring the fence line. He hadn't slept. The symbol carved on the barn door haunted him. An old enemy's promise scratched into his peace. He'd spent half the night thinking of what to tell her, and by sunrise he'd decided to tell her nothing. Some truths only make fear grow. When she stepped into the kitchen, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, the sight almost softened him. Her hair was loose, a few strands falling over her face, and her hands carried the faint scent of soap. "You were up before me again," she said with a small smile. "You never rest, do you?" He didn't look up. "Rest's a thing you earn when you've got nothing left to lose." Her smile faded. She poured water into the kettle, studying his face in the reflection of the window. There was something harder there today, something sharpened by memory. She wanted to ask what weighed on him. But she'd learned that men like him didn't speak their pain easily. They carried it like a saddle that couldn't be taken off. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was alive, pulsing with something unspoken. Outside, the horses stirred, their hooves thudding against frozen ground. He finally stood, buckled his gun belt, and said quietly, "I'll be gone a while. There's a man I need to see." "Is it about the debt?" she asked, though her voice trembled on the word. He paused at the door, gloved hands tightening. "No. The debt's long paid." Then he stepped out, boots crunching against frost, leaving her staring after him, confused and uneasy. That day stretched endless. She kept herself busy, washing, mending, sweeping dust that only returned with every gust through the cracks. But her mind was elsewhere, chasing the look in his eyes before he left. A look that spoke of danger. By evening, clouds had thickened into bruised gray. He hadn't returned. She stepped outside, pulling his coat around her shoulders, scanning the horizon. The wind smelled of rain and gun oil, two things that never promised peace. Miles away, the rancher rode through the canyon trails, following hoof prints that weren't his. The tracks led toward the ridge where outlaws were set to gather. He recognized the mark burned into one tree, 2 slashes crossing a circle. The same mark that had haunted his past. The man he once spared now called himself a leader of thieves. He dismounted near an abandoned shack, the air heavy with gun smoke. Inside lay a bloodied horse blanket and a broken whiskey bottle. A message crude and clear: "We know where you live." When he returned home after midnight, she was waiting by the fire, half asleep but clutching the revolver he'd taught her to use. Her eyes widened when she saw the dirt, the blood streaking his shirt. "Whose blood?" she whispered. "Not mine," he said, voice low. He hung his hat, sat near the fire, and looked at her as though memorizing her face. "They'll come for me soon. Maybe for both of us." "I won't run," she said, trembling but steady. "Not from what's mine." He looked away, fighting the ache that her words caused. "You shouldn't claim what ain't safe to keep." "Then make it safe," she said. And just like that, something shifted between them, something fragile yet fierce. The next few days turned tense and silent. He reinforced the barn doors, moved her bed closer to the back room, and loaded rifles before dawn. At night, he sat by the window, watching the plains under moonlight, every shadow a potential threat. She tried to lighten the air, made stew, sang softly while she worked, told him stories from when she was a child, but his mind was elsewhere. Once she placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch this time. He simply closed his eyes for a long moment, as if the touch reminded him of something worth surviving for. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in, wild wind shaking the roof, thunder cracking open the sky. Amid the roar, he heard horses again. Not his. He rose, calm and cold. "Stay inside," he told her. She grabbed the shotgun. "You taught me better than that." He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes was all conviction. Together they moved through the house, each step measured. Lightning flashed, and in that instant silhouettes appeared through the rain. 3 men. Guns drawn. He whispered, "When I fire, take the far one." Her hands didn't shake. The door splintered open. Gunfire exploded, echoing through the storm. He dropped one, she caught another through the shoulder, her shot clean and fierce. The last man fled into the dark, leaving the taste of blood and smoke in the air. When silence finally fell, she was breathing hard, hair soaked, eyes wide with disbelief at what they'd done. He turned to her, chest heaving, and for a long second neither spoke. Then he said, almost in awe, "You weren't supposed to fight like that." She met his gaze, tears mixing with rain. "You weren't supposed to make me care this much." The fire crackled behind them, the storm easing to a low rumble. He stepped closer, gently brushed her cheek, and for the first time, let himself look at her without the armor. There was fear still, but also something warm, dangerous, and real. Outside, thunder rolled one last time, like a promise that the night wasn't done testing them. The morning after the gunfight rose quiet and red over the plains, painting the world in the color of survival. Smoke still hung low around the barn, and the air smelled of gunpowder and wet earth. The girl, no longer the trembling daughter he'd once pitied, moved through the yard with steady purpose, her braid loose, her eyes sharpened by what they'd endured. The rancher watched her from the porch, a battered man made older by choices, younger by the light in her gaze. He'd thought last night would be the end, that the men who came for him were all that remained of his past. But in the faint tracks leading away from the fence line, he saw otherwise. There were more. The storm had bought them a few hours, nothing more. She came to stand beside him, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not till they've burned it all or buried me under it." "Then I'm not leaving," she said. No hesitation. No tremor in her voice. He looked at her long, as if memorizing something he never thought he'd be given again. "You don't owe me that kind of loyalty." She turned to face him fully. "You think this is about owing? You think I stayed because of pity?" Her voice softened. "You're the first man who ever asked what I wanted. The first who didn't take just because he could." Her words cut deep, deeper than the bullet graze on his arm. For a long while he said nothing. The wind stirred dust between them. Finally he nodded toward the horses. "Then ride with me. If they're coming, we'll meet them halfway." They saddled up in silence. The horizon stretched wide and endless, the kind of space where time felt both infinite and fragile. She rode close, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead, while his mind drifted through years of blood and regret. Every debt he'd collected, every man he'd left in the dust, it had led him here, to a woman who'd chosen him not out of fear but faith. By noon they reached the canyon ridge. Below, 6 riders waited. The leader, scar-faced, wearing a black hat like a crown, spat into the dirt when he saw them. "Didn't think you had the guts to come down yourself," he called. The rancher dismounted slowly, his boots crunching gravel. "I told you once, Ben. You want what's mine, you come and take it." The girl's hand brushed his sleeve, a silent plea for caution. But the moment had been set in motion years ago, back when he spared Ben's life after a botched robbery. Mercy had a price, and today it was due. The first shot cracked the air before words could carry further. Dust burst near his feet. He rolled behind a rock, fired back, and the canyon lit with thunder again. She ducked low, reloading with trembling hands, eyes darting to him through the haze. "Stay down," he barked. "I told you, I'm not leaving you to fight alone," she shouted back, voice breaking but fierce. 2 riders tried to flank them from the left. She saw it first, fired twice, and one fell from his horse. The second charged through the smoke, swinging his rifle like a club. She stumbled, fell against the dirt, but before the blow landed, the rancher was there, knife flashing once, clean and final. Blood spattered the sand. His chest rose and fell heavy, his face set in grim resolve. Ben shouted, "You can't outrun your past, old man." The rancher lifted his gun, calm now. "Ain't trying to." His shot hit true. Ben's hat flew off, and the outlaw dropped hard, a red bloom spreading beneath him. The remaining men hesitated, then fled into the horizon, leaving the echo of their defeat behind. Silence fell. A hawk cried above. The girl pushed herself up, trembling, dust streaked with blood. She looked at him, this man who'd come for a debt and instead found something that looked like redemption. He holstered his gun, breathing ragged. "You all right?" She nodded weakly. "You?" He gave a tired smile. "Still standing. That's more than I deserve." She stepped closer, touched his arm where the blood soaked through. "Maybe it's exactly what you deserve." He looked at her, and for the first time his guard broke completely. He cupped her face in his rough hand, thumb brushing away the dirt and tears. The world seemed to still around them, the canyon, the sky, the silence between breaths. "I came here for money," he said quietly. Thought that was all I was owed. Turns out, it was something else. She leaned into his touch. Then stop owing the past. Start owing yourself something better. They stayed like that for a long while, the dying sun spilling gold over the ridges. Then they rode back home, slow, quiet, side by side. The ranch lay half ruined, but it stood. Smoke from the gunfire curled into the air like prayer threads. He dismounted, helped her down gently, and for once, neither spoke of fear or running. They sat on the porch steps, watching the sky turn from orange to violet. You could leave, he said after a while. Start somewhere new. No debts, no danger. She rested her head against his shoulder. And miss watching you finally live like a man who's done running? No, I'll stay. This place, it's ours now. He laughed softly, a sound foreign to him. You're stubborn. So are you, she replied, smiling faintly. Night crept in, calm and cool. Crickets began their song and the land seemed to exhale. The world had tried to break them both in different ways, but somehow, through the ugliness, they'd found a sliver of something that looked like peace. He leaned back, staring at the stars. Strange thing, he murmured, half to himself. I came here to collect a debt and I ended up paying one instead. To who? She asked softly. He turned his head, eyes glinting in the firelight. To you. For reminding me a man's worth ain't measured by what he owns, but by who he stands beside when it all falls apart. Her fingers found his, and the silence that followed was comfortable, filled with promise instead of fear. When dawn broke again, the rancher rose to fix the broken fence. She followed, barefoot in the dew, carrying his hat. The land glowed new, and though the scars remained, on their hands, their hearts, the walls, they no longer hurt to touch. As the sun climbed higher, he looked toward the horizon and said, half grinning, Guess the debt's settled, huh? She smiled back, sunlight catching her hair. Maybe. But you still owe me breakfast. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's one debt I'll gladly pay. The camera of the world would pull back then, their small figures against an ocean of golden grass, the wind carrying the faint echo of laughter across the plains. The story that began in sin and desperation ended not with a kiss, but with quiet belonging. And if an old campfire voice were telling it, he'd say, out here in the West, some debts are paid in blood, some in gold, and a rare few in love. Remember that, folks, and if you felt this tale in your bones, stay a while longer. There's always another story waiting past the next horizon.